Hello, and welcome back to the Münster podcast. I am your host, Charles, as always, and I have a very special guest here. I have Haaris. Welcome to the show, Haaris.
Hi, thank you. It's good to be here. I watched quite a few of the episodes and it's nice to be here.
Yeah, so Haaris is a guest that we've wanted for a while, but um, it's just it's just difficult to organize his episodes and things like that. And I think we found a topic that you might be interested in talking about too. So it's actually very nice to have you here. How's your day been?
It's been good, thanks. Literally nothing has been done all
Nothing
day
to do. I
on
mean,
my
I think
part.
that's for a lot of people for the whole lockdown situation. But luckily, the Monster Podcast is here to kill some time. Anyway, let's get straight into the episode. So today we will be covering the history of Germany from 1919 to 1929. I'd like to add that if you're interested in more content similar to this, please comment down below what other historical eras you would like to see covered. Please also support our channel by liking and subscribing, as every little contribution goes a long way. The history in this episode is particularly compressed because, unfortunately, it's just all I know. But hopefully, it will get you interested in this kind of niche era of history. Anyway, let's get straight into it. The year is 1919, and Germany has just lost World War One. The peace treaty to conclude the war is known as the Treaty of Versailles, essentially bullying Germany, pinning all the blame on them for the start of the war. More or less, Germany had a lot of land stripped from them, which meant that they had lost 12.5% of its population, 16% of its coal, poles, no, definitely not, and 48% of its iron industry, all of which are pretty important for its economic survival. And this is only the larger picture. I mean, if you really want to get into the Treaty of Versailles, which I'm sure we could do in a future episode, they had so much, just things and privileges taken away from them. But those are the main points. And obviously, this isn't even mentioning the fact that 1.7 million German soldiers died, which obviously the obvious consequence of that is people have died and death is tragic. But it kind of because the amount of people that died and also injured and disabled, you had a lot of widows and orphans, and actually you had a generation of German children who just did not have fathers or mothers, as you will find out later because of all these other terrible things happening in Germany. So that's basically setting the scene here for this little era of history, and you always got to have that in mind when we look at particular events later on in this episode.
Yeah, I think one another important thing is they lost due to the fact they lost all their colonial possessions as well. It did kind of really hurt their prestige, which at that time did have a big effect on the morale and did lead to a lot of the unfortunate events
Hmm.
that were to come in the later decades.
I mean, so they're the effects of the war, but during the war itself, there were problems that we would later see in the Weimar Republic. I mean, they were already brewing in the old monarchy. Even before the war's end, sailors in Kiel mutinied in October 1918, and workers in cities such as Hamburg, Bremen, and Berlin had established workers' councils, basically mini Soviet unions popping up all over Germany. This is even before the war ended. The man who was in charge during this chaos was Friedrich Ebert, who was basically in control after the Kaiser stepped down in November 1918. And to add more fuel to the fire, the British were blockading Germany. So not only were there mutinies and potential communist uprisings, everybody was now also starving to death. Which, as I mentioned earlier, too many people have already died, and the situation has now got worse. Ebert managed to survive by keeping support of the army and also the industrialists, which was incredibly important. Another thing that helped in his favour was that his opposition, the left wing, was incredibly divided, and they weren't good at working together, particularly the KDP and the Social Democrats, the KDP being the German Communist Party. He managed to restore order to the chaos, held elections in January 1919, and with the new government, they drew up a new constitution. So Ebert manages to kind of keep everything together in Germany for now.
I think one of the main things about the constitution was that I think they tried to go a bit too far one way from the other due to all the problems with the monarchy in the previous few decades and since Germany had formed.
Yeah,
And there was always that stigma, even with the previous Prussian country and government, about the fact that after the Napoleonic Wars, there was always that promise of democracy, and that did continue up until the constitution was made, and that was a reason for some of its problems.
I think as well is that a lot of the politics that you see in this interwar period are incredibly reactionary towards monarchies. Obviously, as they would do, since World War One was basically the last huge battle between giant monarchies and such. But particularly in Germany, there was a lot of rejection of, you know, sympathetic views towards monarchies, and I think the constitution definitely shows that.
Yeah.
Um, so things seem okay for Ebert in January 1919, but in the exact same month, Rosa Luxemburg and Liebknecht, two huge communist activists, um, attempted to seize power in Berlin. Um, all whilst there was a lot of street fighting and many people got injured and were even killed, not too many people supported it, so this wasn't actually too big of a threat, in particular because the Freikorps were able to crush it. Now, the Freikorps were a group of ex-militaries who formed a kind of right-wing paramilitary group. Again, it's we have compressed this a little bit, but in a nutshell, that's what they were. They had a particularly huge sympathy towards, as you mentioned, sort of Prussian ideas, and particularly the military. Another communist uprising in the Ruhr occurred in March 1920, when the KDP were able to take much of the region, but once again the Freikorps come to the government's rescue. Threats not only came from the left, however, in June 1920, journalist Wolfgang Kapp and his right-wing followers attempted to take over. They marched into Berlin and proclaimed him as the new Chancellor of Germany. The Weimar government ordered the military to crush the uprising, but they refused because they had sympathies towards these right-wing movements. As a result, the government had to flee from Berlin. But unfortunately for Kapp, there was a trade union strike happening simultaneously, completely coincidentally, but it paralyzed his coup pretty much. There was no access to gas, water, electricity, all of that was cut off, and his coup pretty much fizzled out by itself. Also, it must be noted that around this time, Anton Drexler formed the German Workers' Party, which later became the NSDAP, which we'll talk about later.
I feel that at this time there's too much blame on the government itself for being too weak, but I think we have to realize that the government was forced to be weak due to what the Allies had done to it,
Hmm.
because their army was limited to just 100,000 soldiers. And to compare that with pre-war Germany, which was described as an army with a state, it is a shocking change, and it makes the government weak because all that power that it had has been shifted into another form, and they haven't really harnessed that yet.
Yeah, I think it also must be noted that around this time, huge protests and civil dissent was not uncommon in Europe at this time. I think a very good example of that is France, who actually before World War One had a lot of political problems because of obviously this era. This era is mostly known for, you know, if we're speaking politically, the kind of the rise of socialism and the rise of left wing social democrat movements and such. And one of the areas that was a particular hotbed for was France, and you know, we can still see the legacy of that today because the French tend to be quite like liberal, and they enjoy a good protest. But
And
yeah,
that's kind of spread throughout the entirety of Europe today as well, even not including the Cold War era, even in Western Europe, which wasn't that affected by Soviet policy. Socialism has still had a lasting impact till this day
yeah.
on countries like Britain with the NHS.
Hmm. And I think that would be a very interesting episode in itself, the impact of communism. I mean, socialism is
Yeah.
definitely a product of communism. But anyway, let's get back on track. So, yeah, so it must be known that other countries were also having a lot of instability. Spain, France, for example, are good examples. Hungary actually undergoes a revolution and briefly becomes a communist country in this era too. And the rest of Eastern Europe was in a lot of chaos. Poland and the Soviet Union having wars. Italy undergoing, like a fascist takeover under Mussolini. It's all kicking off in Europe, really. And I think it's unfair to say that Germany was the only unstable area of Europe at the time. It really only gets attention because Hitler comes into the equation at some point, but we'll get on to that in a second. So another event that kind of highlights the instability of Europe at the time is January 1923, when France and Belgium sent troops to occupy the Ruhr. Now, this happened because Germany fell behind in its reparation payments of coal and timber. So in response, the French and Belgians occupied the Ruhr, one of Germany's largest industrial hubs. German workers in the Ruhr went on strike and the reparations stopped altogether. The French, who were particularly vindictive towards the Germans, sent their own workers to operate the industry in the Ruhr, and tensions escalated with resistance where 130 civilians were killed.
I believe they also send some Germans native to the road back to the internal Germany towards Berlin, and that also caused some form of a crisis.
Yeah, so, well, let's talk about the French troops occupying the Ruhr as well. Um, there's a very famous photo of a French soldier in the street of one of these Western German cities, just pointing a gun at this random German elderly man. They were particularly brutal, these French and Belgian troops, and that kind of anti-German sentiment was incredibly common in France at the time. They still had not forgiven Germany for the war. World War One holds a very bitter place in French hearts, I think, as it does in British hearts. But I think in Great Britain, World War One is seen as a tragic thing, whilst in France it's almost like a crime. You know?
I think it's also the fact that the war with Germany before that to unite Germany in the War of 1871 that made it worse
Yeah,
because it was seen as a second German invasion of France, which did just sting that little bit more
and that
after
was
the whole.
yeah, that was only in the 70s as well. So that was in very recent memory. Um,
Yeah.
all that kind of like Victorian era stuff is still in recent memory. I mean, you could kind of group World War One into the Victorian era stuff because although Victoria wasn't alive, I think thematically it makes sense.
Yeah.
Anyway, so they occupy the Ruhr, and here's where the crisis, the first real Weimar crisis begins. Okay, so the resistance that the German workers put up against the occupants was really bad for the economy. Okay, and the economy was already in a vulnerable position, as we mentioned earlier with the Treaty of Versailles. In order to pay for the striking workers, the Germans decided to print more money, and by August, the currency was now worthless. Economics 101 here. You don't have to be a genius, but the more you print money, the less value it has. It's not a good thing to do, especially on the scale that they did it, because it genuinely came to a point where, how do I explain this? The money was so worthless was that it would literally, you could just chuck it in the bin, it'd be okay. It was terrible.
I think there was a story at the time where people buy would burn money instead of coal because it was actually cheaper
Yeah.
to burn the money than it was to buy coal, and there were people who were literally racing to the banks with wheelbarrows because they didn't know if by the time they got their paycheck and by the time they got to the bank if it would be so bad that it wouldn't be worth anything anymore.
And as you could tell, Germany starved once again. So not long after the British blockade during the First World War, Germany starving once again. This is a common trend. You'll see it happening a lot. German people starving to death. The Chancellor, Wilhelm Suno, was still reluctant to end his strategy of passive resistance, and on the 12th of August, after little change and prolonged suffering of the people, his cabinet resigned after a vote of no confidence, and was succeeded by Gustav Stresemann and his great coalition. Stresemann had multiple issues to deal with, not only the issue of the Ruhr and reparations, but also the Nazis in Bavaria and the KDP. One of the immediate problems was hyperinflation, which we just talked about, which had resulted because of the government printing more money. At the height of hyperinflation in October, 4.2 trillion marks were needed to buy $1. Large numbers of people were impoverished, and the failure of the Weimar Republic gave both the left and right plenty of propaganda. So he began. One of the first things Stresemann actually did was immediately he ended resistance towards occupation. Okay, so he told all the workers, stop striking, so we can try to get our economy back on track. It wasn't very popular though, because obviously surrendering to your occupants is not exactly a good looking thing. He also started some economic treaties with their Western allies, so in particular the Dawes and Young plans with American bankers, which helped Germany become a leading manufacturer by 1930, a sort of lasting impact that we still see today. And also with this new economic policies came a new currency called the Rentenmark, which achieved stability and confidence in the German economy once again after it just been demolished.
I do feel that if Hitler hadn't come to power, we would see Stresemann as sort of a Thatcher figure, where he did help aid the economy at risk to some national group due to him either giving up something or just foregoing them for another part of the economy.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think of all the figures in this interwar period, obviously the ones that get talked about a lot are, Chamberlain, Hitler, Franco, Mussolini, Stalin, Lenin. But I think someone that's seriously not talked about enough is Gustav Stresemann. I think he's a good example of the modern politician who seriously gambles in order to get something right. Okay, so I think as you mentioned Thatcher, I think of other examples like Attlee, and Adenauer as well. I think these modern politicians, these huge gambles that they take, I think he's a really good example of one. Right, moving on. Stresemann's challenges wouldn't be over yet, as the Nazi Party, well, they're back again, led a rising in 1923 known as the Munich Putsch. So Hitler and his Nazi Party planned to establish a dictatorship with the support of General Ludendorff, a hero from the First World War. On the 8th of November, Hitler seized the state governor, but the police were able to prevent his uprising from escalating any further, breaking up the march. In addition to this, and to Stresemann's luck, the rebels were more divided than people had originally realised, because in Bavaria, the state commissioner and the commander of the Bavarian army, who originally said they'd help Hitler, backed out when they had the chance. Hitler got arrested, but when put on trial, he was given a minimum sentence and was told he would be released early on probation. The trial not only generated publicity for his cause, but also showed the sympathy of the court towards Hitler. Which, it's foreshadowing, really, isn't it?
I think one of the key parts of that is because Bavaria was so right wing, the courts did allow Hitler to go for a shorter sentence. If it was in somewhere like the Rhineland or further east where it was more left wing, then I think he probably would have got a much harsher sentence, and maybe even be put on trial for treason instead, and maybe sentenced to something like death, which is an interesting thing to show how divided Germany was at the time.
Yeah, and also, another very interesting thing that it shows is that each German area still maintained a very strong individual identity. So we still have to remember that at the time, Germany as a united country was still somewhat recent. Um, like
Yeah.
maybe 80 years old as a country. So as a result,
I don't think that. I think it was in the
yeah.
70s.
So I think as a result, these individual areas. I mean, they still do now, obviously, as countries tend to have different cultural areas in different provinces. But for a newly united country, we you couldn't you can't underestimate it really, especially for Bavaria, which tends to be a very royalist, sort of
Yeah.
area of Germany, very traditional, still is today.
Yeah.
So following the multiple crises, the Weimar Republic entered, a kind of golden age. So from 1924 and 1929, Germany was seen as the center of cultural and European affairs, and once again encouraged by Stresemann. And he actually became foreign minister during this time. Um, we'll get onto that in a second. So architecture and painting developed, um, and film and all these in journalism. It was actually really fantastic. So normally you see France and Paris as that sort of center of Europe, but during this time, because the Weimar Republic was kind of booming almost, surprisingly, really, that perspective changed, which I thought is incredibly interesting because Paris has always been that on that pedestal, especially for like the last 300 years. So Stresemann actually became the foreign minister after being given a vote of no confidence because he attempted very boldly to overthrow the SPD and KDP governments in Saxony, which got him voted out. But he managed to stay and become foreign minister. So Stresemann's foreign policy during this era was a policy of rapprochement with France and Britain, which made him incredibly unpopular with right-wing parties, but it saw the stability of Germany's frontiers with France through the Locarno treaties in 1925, Germany joining the League of Nations in 1926, and the withdrawal of the Allied Disarmament Commission in January 1927. All good things for the Weimar Republic. Stresemann, for his foreign policies, actually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1926. In fact, Nobel Peace Prizes from 1925 to 1927 were all awarded to laureates that were involved with the Locarno treaties or German foreign relations in some capacity. In a Nobel lecture in 1927, Stresemann stated that here we encounter two conflicting concepts with which we must come to grips with in our time, the idea of national solidarity and the idea of national cooperation. History obviously shows that Stresemann chose international cooperation. Despite being accused of high treason during the passing of the Young Plan, which we mentioned earlier, Stresemann persevered and delivered on all of his main philosophies of rapprochement. So yeah, kind of fleshing out the character of Gustav Stresemann, and as we spoke earlier, these modern politicians like to take these gambles. Stresemann definitely gambled with the foreign policy, okay, because the Germans, especially the right-wing parties, were incredibly resentful of kind of opening up to the Western world and becoming friends with people that used to be our enemies. And I think that gamble paid off, despite the
I feel
protests.
like one of I feel like one of the problems that Germany did have at the time was because there weren't enough leaders like Stresemann, where I think his policies may have had greater effect and greater admiration across the German people if it had taken place over maybe a few decades, and thus it wouldn't have stirred up the nationalist hatred that it did from far right groups, and ultimately lead to the resentment against Europe that did cause, well, at least have some cause for the rise of the Nazis in the next decade.
Yeah, and it's also kind of has to be said that Streismann's kind of rule, let's say, was kind of cut short. So his attempt to overthrow his government in Saxony, first of all, got him voted out, more or less. So he stayed as a foreign minister for a few more years. But that was cut short too because, unfortunately, I believe he got cancer. I think, yeah, so unfortunately his life was cut short. But for what he did do, he seriously could have his works, if it just stayed around a little bit longer, if somebody continued it, which nobody really did, definitely would have helped
Yeah.
Germany in the long term.
I feel like the main problem with Germany at that time was because they did have so many political parties due to their constitution, as a part of them trying to be this, like, the arsenal of democracy at the time, where it was the most democratic country at the time, which was a stark contrast to what it had been before and what it would be afterwards. Due to the role Germany wanted to take at the time, it kind of hampered the ability of their leaders because their leaders focused on uniting a party rather than uniting a country, which did lead to
Yeah,
their
that's a very
downfall.
good point. So I think the focus perhaps was in the wrong place, and ultimately that kind of ironically it hurt them. You know,
Yeah.
from the inside, it's like a rotten apple from the inside going out on the outside. From in to out, it really wasn't good. Anyway, so we're talking about the successes of the Weimar Republic in this era, but there were still many issues. Farmers are always suffering in history, but in Germany, they suffered from falling prices. The middle class, also known as the Mittelstand, remained resentful, believed that they had been betrayed by the Republic due to the loss of their savings during hyperinflation and the lack of compensation that followed. Industry saw an increase in strikes as business owners and workers clashed over where the reinvestment of money should go towards. Overall, whilst industry may have grown in capacity, agriculture once again saw a decline. In 1929, half of all German farms were struggling to make a profit, and large-scale peasant protests occurred, with some looking towards more extreme solutions, particularly in the north of Germany. Now, here's the turning point of the Weimar Republic. So you have all this amazing stuff happening that we just talked about, and the not so amazing stuff that's happening kind of, hidden away. But here's the real turning point. In 1925, Hindenburg gets elected president. Okay, Paul von Hindenburg, if you don't know, was a very famous general from the First World War, whose achievements include victories at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes. However, this was bad news for the Republic, as Hindenburg seemed to express lukewarm support for democracy and favoured a return to a traditional monarchy. Now, despite all of this, political and economic stability looked to have been more or less achieved, as many parties acted less hostile towards each other, and members of the Mittelstand kind of lost their suspicion for socialism. Now, Hans Erdmann von Leidner-Wildau, a member of the DNVP, stated that even the DNVP, a monarchist and nationalist party, must now integrate itself into the Weimar system. So he said, the Republic is beginning to stabilize itself and the German people is beginning to become reconciled to the status quo. Now is the moment when we must not hesitate. If we wish to retain and reinforce the DNVP as an influential and powerful movement in the right, we must move to share power in the state. The era of progress was marked, as we mentioned earlier, with the death of Gustav Stresemann on the 3rd of October 1929 after suffering a stroke in Berlin. Weeks later, on the 29th of October 1929, share prices in New York collapsed, and the Great Depression changed the world and Germany for good. So, kind of poetically, as soon as Stresemann dies, everything collapses basically. So the Great Depression, we know everything that happened after that.
I do feel like Stresemann was kind of it was like the golden age of the Weimar Republic, where during his lifetime things weren't the best, but they were the best they would be for Weimar
I think they're
Germany.
the best they
And
could have been.
yeah, or given the circumstances in the Treaty of Versailles and the fact that Germany was so hated at on the world stage after World War One, Stresemann did do what he could do, and I do think if Stresemann had gotten the recognition he did deserve, he would be seen as kind of the hero of Germany, like the hero of the Weimar Republic. Sorry, like Winston Churchill is seen as the hero of the United Kingdom today. He did solve many of the problems of Weimar Germany, but he couldn't solve one of the main problems, which was it was divided. And even Hindenburg, due to the fact that he was such a uniting force, even he couldn't completely solve all the divisions within Germany at that time, which did end up playing themselves off of each other and causing greater harm during and after the rise of the Nazis.
Yeah, and I think another important thing as well is that living conditions as a whole in Europe were not very good. So we mentioned earlier about the industry and the farmers and things like that. Um, wasn't very uncommon, to be honest. Once again, France is a very good example. Eastern Europe. Let's not even talk about the Soviets if we're going to talk about living conditions. Um, it was actually very uncommon. It wasn't very uncommon. I mean, so once again, it's kind of getting pointed out. I don't know if this is because it's an anti-German bias that people tend to remember it more, or if it's just kind of ignorance, you know. But there we go.
But that's a key point as well, because in America, even after the Wall Street crash, there were Hoovervilles, but people tend to focus on the harsh economic climate and social climate within Germany because we all know Hitler and we look from it backwards. Where if you look from it forwards, there was an equal chance of a real nationalist or authoritarian leader rising up anywhere around the world
Yeah, I think
due
there's a
to
pretty
what
good
happened.
chance. I think actually, um, I keep mentioning it over and over again, but France, seriously, France is this. You know, there was a brief point in modern French history where they could have been socialist, like not socialist,
Yeah.
like straight up communist, because the amount of kind of communists and other intellectuals flocking to France was genuinely immense, and it's actually quite interesting to read into. Perhaps we will do an episode on that. Um, but yeah, I think the UK also could have had a very nationalistic sort of leader. Obviously Churchill was, but when I mean nationalist, that's not sorry, nationalistic. I mean something like Oswald Mosley, who became a very divisive figure during this period too. So actually, the interwar period, it was a very turbulent time for the world. To be honest, incredibly turbulent.
But that's the thing as well, because even the King, Edward the Eighth, who was a little bit after the time, was sympathetic to the Nazis, and he did have the support of Churchill, which we see Churchill as like the great savior of British democracy, but he did support a king who supported the Nazis. And like you said with Oswald Mosley, the British Union Fascists did have close ties with the Nazi Party because I think Oswald Mosley was married to one of the Milford sisters who were in close contact to Hitler at the time. And that was a real fear within Britain at the time and around the world that Britain could be subject to a fascist coup due
And
to this close relationship.
later on in the 1930s, when Spain descended into a civil war between Franco and his basically nationalists and the Republic, which were the communists and some Democrat forces too. I think that also is an event that not enough people should know about. I think more people should know about the Spanish Civil War because what the Spanish Civil War showed was the I think the Spanish Civil War really represents the 20th century quite well. Okay, so it's the kind of out with the old ideas, so the monarchy, and in with the new ideas, so democracy, communism, and fascism, nationalism, Nazism, that kind of right wing ideas. And what the Spanish Civil War showed, you had volunteers coming to Spain from all over the world. So obviously the main ones being Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union, but you had so many volunteers coming from the United Kingdom, France, Ireland, the United States. It was actually, it's incredibly strange to think about these people coming together purely based on ideology. And I think it's absolutely fascinating. George Orwell fought in that war as well, which, many other famous people probably joined in too. I think it's absolutely fascinating that a war like that even happened.
And it also shows how fears were aligned at the time, because back then the fear was very much so on communism and how there was a fine line between the different ideologies at the time about and how it really was like a nationalistic world that people were just focusing on trying to keep their country and safe and stable, and that they thought if the growth of socialism or communism would continue, that it would ultimately lead to a terrible world for them, and that is one of the reasons why Nazism wasn't stopped in Germany, and fascism in general wasn't considered as big of a threat as communism was, and that's why it was allowed to rise as quickly as it did with little opposition.
Yeah, and I think another interesting point is that the British government were very sympathetic towards Franco when he first rose up in the Civil War. So I think that supports what you said about people being a little bit more sympathetic towards fascism than they were communism. I think also the thing with communism is that it's as an ideology, I feel like it's less flexible. So what I mean by
Yeah,
that is that with communism, you really need to start again. Like you really need to build a country up from scratch, to be honest, to fit it with the ideology. But with fascism, I feel like you can. It's a bit more malleable, and actually, and the reason I say that is because each different leader, fascistic leader, has their own kind of brand of fascism. You know, like Hitler's
yeah.
fascism isn't the same as Mussolini's fascism, and it's not the same as Franco's or Pinochet's or anything. It's all different. So I think because of that, people are more fearful of it because there's a lot more to lose. Well, it appears as though there's a lot more to lose. Whether there is or not, you can decide.
And at that time, dictators weren't all too uncommon because even in Portugal, there was Salazar, which was seen as some form of a dictator at the time, and it wasn't a very uncommon thing around the world and Europe. I believe there was actually like almost an even split between democratically elected and dictators at the time.
Yeah. So not the most stable and nicest of times. This interwar period. Perhaps you could even argue that the rise of the Nazis was a good thing because it finally got rid of all the dictators. Well, if you think that dictators were a bad thing, that is. But that is for a different episode. I think now's a good time to wrap it up. So thank you very much for watching or listening to this episode of the Monster Podcast. If you liked this format, please let us know. And if there are any other historical eras or events or people that you'd like us to cover in the Monster Podcast, please let us know too. Any final words, Haaris?
Hi, I'm Haaris.
Hopefully we'll see Haaris some more in some future episodes, some more argumentative episodes perhaps. It would be very interesting. Anyway, it's a pleasure having you here, Haaris. Thank you so much for giving
Thank
your
you. It's a
time
pleasure
here.
to be on.
Yeah. And that was the Monster Podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in.